Alexander Cross had spent the past year living with an anger that money couldn't quiet and power couldn't control. It was the kind of rage that burned low and steady, never exploding, just waiting, pressing against his ribs like a constant reminder that the world had taken something from him it had no right to touch. Every morning he passed the sunlit windows of his mansion and remembered how those same walls used to hold his daughter's laughter, loud, untamed, and pure. That sound had vanished the day her legs stopped working. He had spared no expense, hiring the most sought-after surgeons, therapists, and specialists in the world, chasing every shred of hope until there was nothing left to chase. And still she sat in silence, her eyes fixed somewhere he could never reach. Then came the afternoon that shifted everything. A warm wind moved across the lawn as he stepped outside, expecting the same heavy quiet, and instead saw her laughing. Not the polite, forced smile she gave to please him during therapy sessions, but the deep, unrestrained joy he thought had been buried forever. Sitting beneath the maple tree, Isabella's face was lit with life again. In front of her stood a boy, barefoot, clothes worn thin, eyes alive with mischief, moving in a strange, clumsy dance that seemed to pull her back from whatever distant place she'd been living in. Alexander froze. He didn't know the boy. The boy shouldn't have been there. And yet, in that instant, it felt like this stranger had done something no one else could. Something all the money in his bank account had failed to buy. Who was he? How did he know exactly what would reach her? And why did Alexander's gut tell him that this moment, as beautiful as it was, would lead to something far more complicated? Stay with me, because what began as a fleeting spark of happiness would unravel into questions no one wanted answered, truths buried deep beneath trust, and a choice that would test every line Alexander thought he'd never cross. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Alexander Cross was not the kind of man who allowed strangers into his world. His name alone carried weight in boardrooms across the country, a billionaire tech investor in his mid-40s, sharp-minded, guarded, and, since the accident, far more private than most could imagine. His daughter, Isabella Cross, just 8 years old, had once been the beating heart of his life, a child whose boundless energy could soften even his hardest days. But after the mysterious accident that left her paralyzed from the waist down, she withdrew into herself, speaking less, smiling rarely, shutting out anyone who tried to reach her. That was why the sight of her laughing with a boy she had never met was more than surprising. It was impossible. The boy was no older than 9, his clothes worn thin, his face carrying the confidence of someone who had survived more than his share. He was homeless. Alexander would learn that soon enough, yet here he was, standing on the manicured lawn of one of the most heavily guarded estates in the city. How did a child with no place to call home end up inside the walls of a billionaire's property without being stopped? Why had Isabella opened her heart to him when she'd shut it so firmly against the rest of the world? And most pressing of all, what truth about this boy would turn Alexander's life upside down? Those answers would not come easily, and when they did, nothing about Alexander's life, his family, or his fortune would ever be the same. The day began like so many others in the Cross estate. Alexander Cross was locked in back-to-back business calls from his home office, his voice calm and controlled as he negotiated with executives scattered across time zones. The staff moved quietly through the hallways, each person aware of the unspoken rule to keep noise to a minimum. Outside, in the walled garden beyond the south terrace, Isabella Cross sat in her wheelchair under the shade of a maple tree, her gaze fixed on the still pond. It was the same image Alexander had seen for months, motionless, distant, unreachable. But that afternoon, something shifted. A flicker on the corner of a security feed caught Alexander's eye. Movement near the garden gate. He turned his attention to the monitor, and there he was, a barefoot boy, clothes threadbare, stepping cautiously across the manicured grass, as though he knew he didn't belong. The cameras caught every step, his small frame silhouetted against the sunlight, his eyes locked on Isabella. Then, without a word, the boy began to move. It wasn't graceful. His arms swung wide, his feet stumbled in the grass. But there was something in the rhythm, in the unrestrained energy, that broke through the stillness like a sudden rush of air. And then it happened. Isabella's face lit up. Not the reserved, practiced smile she offered when someone was watching, but a genuine, radiant expression Alexander hadn't seen in over a year. Her laughter carried faintly through the open windows, and it stopped Alexander mid-sentence on his call. Outside, 2 security guards were already moving toward the boy, ready to pull him away. Alexander's voice cut through the radio before they could reach him. "Wait." He rose from his desk, stepped outside, and watched from the terrace. The boy kept dancing, Isabella kept laughing, and for a brief moment, time seemed to hold still. Alexander felt something he hadn't in months: hope. But just beneath it, a question took root. Who was this boy? And why did it feel like he wasn't here by chance? What Alexander didn't yet know was that the boy's presence was no accident, and someone inside the mansion already knew exactly who he was. Alexander Cross didn't act on impulse, but that afternoon something in him overrode every instinct to keep his distance. He called off the guards and walked down to the garden, the crunch of gravel under his shoes drawing the boy's eyes for the first time. Isabella was still smiling, her cheeks flushed with the effort of laughing. As Alexander drew closer, she reached for his hand, her voice soft but urgent. "Daddy, please don't chase him away. He makes me happy." Alexander crouched beside her chair and asked quietly if she knew him. She shook her head, but her eyes never left the boy. Turning to him, Alexander asked his name. "Ethan," he said, voice steady despite the setting. A few careful questions revealed fragments. No parents, no home, nights spent in a downtown shelter when there was space, under bridges when there wasn't. Against his better judgment, Alexander invited him inside. The kitchen staff watched as the boy devoured the food placed in front of him. But what caught Alexander's attention wasn't just his hunger. It was the tune he hummed between bites. It was Isabella's favorite song, one she hadn't touched on the piano since the accident. When Alexander asked him where he'd heard it, Ethan hesitated, then said he'd once heard it through an open window while passing by at night. Later in the sitting room, Ethan shifted in his chair and mimicked a dance move, a small, distinctive step with a spin that Alexander had seen Isabella perform hundreds of times before, back when she could still walk. She gasped, clapped her hands, and laughed again, leaning forward as if she might join him. This wasn't coincidence. Ethan knew things about her only someone close, or someone who had been watching and would know. And then Alexander noticed something else. The way 2 of the longtime staff members exchanged glances when Ethan spoke, how one of them avoided looking at him altogether. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Some of them knew who he was. That night, Alexander made a call. He wanted a full background check, school records, shelter logs, anything that could piece together where Ethan had been. While waiting for results, he returned to the security room and began reviewing weeks of camera footage. Hours of uneventful recordings rolled by until in one frame, Alexander saw him, Ethan, standing just outside the south wall, weeks before the dance in the garden. Another angle showed him again, days later, at the north gate, watching. And then, as Alexander sifted through the footage from the night of Isabella's accident, he froze. There, in the grainy image, illuminated by the faint glow of the driveway lights, was Ethan, smaller, younger, but unmistakably him, standing near the property's edge as the chaos unfolded. Alexander Cross didn't wait for the background report before he acted. The image from the night of the accident was burned into his mind, and the questions it raised would not let him rest. The next morning, he instructed one of the staff to bring Ethan to his study. The boy walked in quietly, his hands deep in his pockets, wearing the same calm, unreadable expression he'd worn since the day they met. Alexander didn't waste time. "You were here the night Isabella's accident happened," he said, his voice low, steady, but edged with steel. Ethan didn't flinch. He looked at Alexander for a long moment, then nodded once. "I was," he said. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes locked on the boys. "Tell me why." What came next was not the answer he expected. Ethan explained that he had been walking near the property that night, close enough to see the garden path where Isabella had been in her wheelchair. He saw her start down the slope and then saw the brakes fail. But the way he described it, the brakes hadn't failed on their own. They had been loosened, deliberately tampered with. Alexander's pulse quickened. The official investigation had concluded it was a tragic mechanical fault, nothing more. But Ethan insisted he had seen someone, a figure whose face he couldn't make out, bent over the wheelchair just minutes before Isabella set off down the path. Then Ethan said something that lodged deep in Alexander's mind and refused to let go. They didn't want her to get back up. Alexander asked who he thought it was. Ethan hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly toward the door, as if to check who might be listening. "It was someone from inside," he said finally. "Someone who belonged in the house. Someone Isabella should have been able to trust." The words hung between them like a weight neither could lift. Alexander felt the ground shift beneath him. His world was already fragile, but this, the possibility that someone within his own circle had intentionally hurt his daughter, threatened to shatter it completely. And now, he had to decide whether to shield Isabella from this truth to preserve what peace she had left, or to expose everything, knowing it could destroy the only stability she'd managed to hold on to. Alexander Cross sat alone in his study long after Ethan had gone, the boy's words circling in his head like a storm with no end. Someone inside his walls had taken his daughter's future from her, and they were still here, living under his roof or within arm's reach. The most natural response, and the one every part of him screamed for, was to call the police, hand over the footage, and let the law tear apart every lie. But then, he pictured Isabella sitting in that wheelchair, hearing the truth that someone she trusted had caused it, and he froze. He knew her fragile peace would fracture, and the laughter he'd seen just days ago might vanish again. This time for good. He thought of that night a year ago. Isabella had been recovering from a sprained ankle, using a small wheelchair temporarily to get around the property. It was supposed to be harmless, just a way to keep her off her feet while she healed. But when the brakes failed on the garden slope, she'd been thrown forward into the marble edge of the fountain, the impact leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. The official report had called it a tragic mechanical fault. Now he knew better. That night, after the staff had retired, Alexander reviewed the footage over and over until he could make out more detail. A partial profile, a distinctive watch glinting under the faint garden lights. He recognized it instantly. The next morning, he asked that staff member into his office, closed the door, and placed the frozen frame from the footage on the desk between them. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply told them he knew, and that they would leave quietly, forever, with no chance to return. The staff member's face drained of color, but they didn't deny it. They gathered their things and were gone within the hour. When Ethan asked later if the person who hurt Isabella had been caught, Alexander didn't give names. Instead, he said quietly, "They won't come near her again." Then, after a long pause, Ethan frowned. "Why are you giving me a home? You don't even know me." Alexander's answer came without hesitation. "Because you've given my daughter something no doctor, no therapist, and no amount of money could give her: her smile." In the days that followed, Isabella's laughter returned more often. She spoke more, smiled more, and even began participating in therapy sessions she used to avoid. Weeks later, during a routine checkup, her doctor pulled Alexander aside. "I don't know what you're doing," he said, "but keep it up. I'm seeing progress I didn't expect at this stage." The improvement wasn't enough for her to walk again, but it was enough to give her hope. And that, Alexander knew, was the first step toward any kind of recovery. Yet even as peace settled over the mansion, Alexander knew one thing remained true. The person responsible hadn't acted alone. The look in the culprit's eyes during that brief confrontation had said it all. Someone else had given the order. And that someone was still out there close enough to strike again. Alexander Cross never told Isabella the full truth. He decided her smile was worth more than any justice he might chase. The boy who had once lingered at the edges of the property now sat at the family table each evening, making her laugh so hard she sometimes forgot the weight she carried. But when the house was quiet, and Ethan was asleep, Alexander would sit alone in his study with the lamp casting long shadows across the desk. In the drawer beside him was a sealed envelope. Inside, evidence that could expose more than one set of guilty hands. He had removed a threat, but the feeling in his gut told him the story wasn't finished. Someone else knew, someone else had played a part, and one day, they might try again. So he kept the cameras running, his guard high, and his resolve higher. If you were in Alexander's place, would you risk telling Isabella the truth and take away her fragile peace, or keep the secret to protect her? Let us know what you think in the comments. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what's coming next.